Okay, so it looks like we have a few people still joining, but we've got a good crowd already at the very beginning. Thank you for joining us for this webinar about the APSA Doctoral Dissertation Research Improvement Grant. We're really excited to offer this opportunity for graduate students and to be able to chat with you all about it a little bit. I am Megan McConaughey. I'm the director of the Congressional Fellowship Program at APSA. I also work on the Doctoral Dissertation Research Improvement Grants. And this is Jessica Keefe. She's the Research Grants Manager at APSA. So we're going to start with a little bit of a presentation, just go through some of the specs, the basics of the program, and eligibility, some of the things you should keep an eye out with your application, and some suggestions maybe as you think about putting together your application and hopefully submitting that, whether that's this year or in the future. And then after that, we should have plenty of time to answer whatever questions you have about your application, about things that come up during the presentation, anything like that. We will go ahead and use the question and answer function for the webinar. So as questions come to you, you can go ahead and open that up, type in your question. That'll get to us. We'll probably hold most of the questions till the end and then just sort of answer them all together. But feel free to enter a question whenever you have one. And I think that's all. So let's go ahead and get started. I do have some slides that I'm going to share with you at the beginning. Okay. So the basics about the APSA DDRIG program. It is funded through an NSF grant, and it really is meant to sort of take the place of the former NSF DDRIG political science program. We're funded at a level where we can provide between 20 and 25 awards each year of between $10,000 and $15,000 each. This past year, our inaugural grantee cycle in 2020, we had 23 grantees. They're fantastic. You can find out about them on our website. We're really excited to be working with them. For each year, we're going to have a spring application cycle. For 2020, the deadline is June 15th. So put that on your calendar if you're interested in applying this year. And it applies to dissertation research focused on advancing knowledge and understanding of citizenship, government, and politics that is theoretically derived and empirically oriented. And we'll talk a little bit about the specifics of what we mean by those things in a couple of minutes. But a key thing to note is that we understand all of those things pretty broadly. So if you think that it's plausible that your project might fall under that umbrella, go ahead and apply or let us know and we can help work out whether or not that's actually the case. So a couple of specific things to keep in mind about the program, either because you might be familiar with the former NSF program and sort of the specifics of that, or just to keep in mind it's important to us to have a broad, substantive, and methodological view of political science. So as I was saying, we understand the eligibility topically and definitely methodologically for this grant to be pretty broad. We have sort of the four major subfields of political science, but we understand that there are a whole bunch of things that fall under political science. So things that are more focused on public policy, certainly REP, certainly gender and sexuality studies, a whole variety of broad substantive things that fall under political science. We are very open to those applications and methodologically as well. I know rightly or not, there are some sort of assumptions about the types of projects that NSF is likely to fund. And we want to make sure that people understand that we understand the appropriate methods in political science to be quite varied. And you might be doing experiments, you might be doing ethnographic fieldwork. Those are all perfectly reasonable things to apply for DDRIG grants to support. Another thing that we're really excited to be able to do and to sort of add to what the NSF was able to do is we have a professional development component to these grants. So when you are an APSA DDRIG grantee, we will have meet and greets with the other grantees so that you can get to know them and do some networking that way. And then also workshops and things where we can help with your professional development. So maybe that's networking, maybe that's job market packets, that sort of thing. We have a whole variety of professional development programming at APSA, and we're really glad to be able to take that to you as graduate students in the DDRIG program. A small thing to note, but if you're familiar with the NSF program, it is important, is that for us, we consider the student as the official research scholar. And that means that you as the student can go ahead and go into the system and submit your proposal yourself. You don't need to work with your advisor to submit your proposal. You don't need to work through your Office of Sponsored Research to submit your proposal. Now, that said, you certainly do need to connect with your advisor. And as you put together your proposal, there's an advisor support form. So we need to make sure that your advisor is on board with your proposal, all of that. And it's also a good idea to connect with your Office of Sponsored Research before you go ahead and submit your proposal. But that's not required. You don't have to submit through your Office of Sponsored Research. You can do that yourself. Some details about the grant in particular. The grant can run for 1 or 2 years. So depending on what exactly the project is that you want funding for and what your timeline on that is, you can describe your research timeline and your expenditure timeline as going over 1 or 2 years. We do accept requests for no-cost extensions. So we know that research is not always predictable, particularly in these times. We know that there are unexpected delays and that sort of thing. And so if your research doesn't get completed in the time that you originally proposed, we certainly accept requests to extend the amount of time that you have to finish your projects. The grant period may end before your dissertation defense, and that's fine. This is largely funding that is meant to support research activities that you're likely then going to have to write up. So depending on exactly where you are in the process and exactly where these research activities fit in with your writing process, it's entirely fine for the grant period to end and for you not have defended your dissertation yet. So you might finish up the grant period and then take another year to finish writing up your results and finish your dissertation defense, and that's fine. And then the grant funds are going to be dispersed through your institution. So although you don't need to work with your Office of Sponsored Research to submit your application, you will need to work with them if you are selected as a grantee, because they'll need to agree to the terms and conditions of the grant, and then they'll actually receive the grant funds. And you'll have to work with them and their policies for reimbursement or use of the grant funds. They keep an eye on that. And that's really good for both APSA and also the grantees for a couple of reasons. One, that means that since the grantees are not receiving the funds directly, they won't be taxed as a stipend or something like that. The other thing about that is that it just sort of helps everyone keep track of the money and make sure that things are going the way that they need to go. A few notes on eligibility. So you need to be a graduate student at a US-based institution. Note, there's no citizenship requirement. So we do not require you to be a US citizen, but you do need to be a graduate student at a US-based institution. And that means an institution that is accredited in and has a campus in the United States. You must be at the point of initiating or conducting dissertation research, which means that really before applying, you ought to have completed your prospectus defense or progressed to candidacy, sort of however your program does that. We know that in this particular year, there are still some logistical challenges to doing some things like that. So if you have a date set that's a little bit further in the summer and you know that you're going to have your prospectus defense, but that hasn't quite happened by the application date, we can work with that. But we do need you to have progressed to candidacy by the time that the funds are dispersed sometime in the fall. The projects must be empirically oriented basic research. One question that we get a lot about that is whether theorists are eligible for these awards. And the answer is maybe. So we know that there are plenty of theory projects out there that include some sort of empirical element to them. And those projects would be eligible for this award. But the research activities that you're applying for the award for do need to have some sort of empirical element to them. And they also have to be basic research, which for most of the things that we're talking about, that's going to fit under basic research, but essentially it needs to be looking for general answers to empirical phenomena, not a specific policy or something like that. It's also open to all methodological approaches and substantive focuses that fall within the broad categories of citizenship, government, and politics. I talked about that a bit earlier, but that's really important. We want to make sure that people don't hesitate to go ahead and apply to this because they're not sure if their project fits substantively or methodologically. Some examples of the types of projects that this might support, and these are not comprehensive. There are other types of activities that it might support, but these grants are meant to support things like travel to conduct research at field sites, archives, specialized collections, anything that you might need to travel to. Data collection activities, so that might include surveys, experiments, focus groups, interviews, things like that. Cost for equipment necessary for the conduct of the research. Note, necessary for the conduct of the research is a really important phrase there. So sort of routine and cost for non-routine materials and supplies as well. For both of those things, routine equipment that you would generally be assumed to need for completion of your dissertation, that sort of thing. So a laptop, just sort of a basic laptop, aren't going to fit under the types of activities that are supported by this grant. On the other hand, if you needed a laptop with a specific, or a computer with a specific computing capacity to complete a particular project, that might fall under the types of things that are supported by these grants. Also things like cost for data transcription or translation, those sorts of things. So all of this you can find on our website, and you can certainly find if you click through and take a look at the application and what you would need to fill out. But I wanted to just put a list of the things that are required for the application up here, and then point out a couple of things. First, the project description and research plan. That's sort of the meat of your application. That's what we'll talk about when I give you some tips for successful applications a little bit later on. Most of that will fall under this project description and research plan. One thing to note is that this should not be a version of your prospectus. So your prospectus will fit into it. There's a lot about your project and what you're working on that's going to be important and that you'll probably port into this project description. But this really needs to be focused on the grant itself. So your project description and research plan really need to focus on what you're going to do with the grant money. What are the research activities that you're going to undertake using the grant money? And how is that going to contribute to your overall dissertation? A second really important part of the application is the budget and budget justification. You want to be really clear about the activities that you want us to support. You want to be really clear about where you got your budget numbers and what that looks like, and how you'll be using your money. And this is someplace where consulting with your Office of Sponsored Research, even though you don't need to go through them toward the beginning of the process, is actually going to be really helpful. They know their own regulations about things like fringe benefits if you need to hire an undergrad RA to do transcription, or whether or not it's feasible to go ahead and give cash payments to interview participants, or all of those things. You'll be working with their regulations when you actually use the funds. And so talking to them about what their regulations are as you put together the budget and budget justification are going to make things a lot easier down the line if you are selected as a grantee and need to work with them to get the terms and conditions confirmed. The data management plan, this is one of those things that feels like it's just a bit of a throwaway. It's one of those sort of administrative things that we ask you to do. And it really is important. And there are two things that you should think about when putting together a data management plan. One is data security. So depending on exactly the type of data that you're collecting and its sensitivity, that sort of thing, we want to make sure that you can keep your data secure and that you're not running up against any ethical lines or putting anyone in danger by how you are storing and managing your data. But we also want to know how you're going to share your data if that's possible. And so these are two sort of important things to think about when you're doing your data management plan. And we find that a lot of people maybe think about one but not the other. But we want to know to the extent that it's feasible for you to share your data and make that available to other people. How do you plan to do that? When do you plan to do that? And it's always important to keep your data secure and keep information, particularly if you're working with human subjects, secure. So how do you plan to do that as well? And similarly, the research ethics statement, it's one of those things that seems like it's sort of a throwaway admin requirement, but it's really important. We take research ethics seriously. Human subjects are a big part of that, but not the only part of that. And so taking some time to think about your commitment to research ethics, maybe look at sort of the guidance that APSA has for research ethics and think about how that fits in. It's an important part of the application as well. So we have the application, you've gone through, you've completed everything. What happens next? We use a panel review process. So that means that each year we put together a panel to review all of the applications. Each proposal is read by 3 reviewers. We select the reviewers for each proposal based on a balance of subfield and methodological fit. And one thing to note here is that we think that it's really important for each proposal to be interesting and compelling to someone who has a research background that's very similar, but we also want it to be interesting and compelling to the field more broadly. So usually the way we think about assigning those 3 reviewers is we want to make sure that at least one of them is really substantively in the same wheelhouse as the application. At least one of them is really methodologically in the same wheelhouse as the application. And then the other one is a little bit further afield. So we want someone with a little bit more of an outside perspective. Now note, all of these reviewers are political scientists in some way. They are in political science or government or public policy departments. We're not sort of going for interdisciplinary reviews here. But we do want to make sure that sort of broadly within political science, each of the projects that receives a grant is interesting and compelling overall. So you want to be able to speak in your application to not just that person that is working on really close to exactly the same thing you are. You also want to be able to speak to the field overall. And then once we've got these reviews by the 3 reviewers, we have a full panel meeting and talk through the applications, and the panel as a whole recommends a variety of applications for funding. So thinking about what makes a successful application. One thing to keep in mind is to make sure to engage the review criteria explicitly. You can read a little bit about this on the website. I think it's included in the application as well, as we tell you sort of what you should include in your project description and research plan. But the two main review criteria are the same as what NSF uses, and those are intellectual merit and broader impact. And that's based on, for intellectual merit, the project's potential to advance knowledge and understanding within political science and across fields. And for broader impact, it's the project's potential to benefit society more broadly. Those are pretty broad. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that you're explicitly engaging both of those criteria and telling us exactly how your project fits in with those criteria that APSA is using and that we take from NSF, because this is NSF money ultimately, and we want to make sure that these projects are moving forward the things that NSF needs to move forward. You want to make sure to strategically use the space you have. It's a lot of space, but it's not endless. So again, this shouldn't be sort of a retread of your prospectus. You want to be focused. You want to make sure that you're focusing on the research activities that need funding and how those research activities and these funds are going to make your project better. If you have preliminary results, you might not. We understand that sometimes that's something that happens, sometimes it isn't. But if you happen to have done a pilot or something like that, if you have a whole bunch of documents, but you're looking to get some more documents, clearly explain what those results are and how the proposed activities will strengthen or extend them. So one question that comes up sometimes is, well, I mean, they already have these results. They already have all of these documents. They already have all of this research. Why do they need this additional funding to get that much more data, that many more documents, anything like that? So you want to be clear about both the results that you already have and also how the additional funding and the additional activities are going to improve your project. Consider your audience. So we talked about that a little bit already. You're looking at an audience that is political scientists, but isn't necessarily in your specific subfield. So consider political science as a whole when you're putting together your application. Focus on the impact of the grant. So these grants are not an award for the best dissertation project. You could have the best dissertation project in the world, and if it just doesn't seem like that extra $10,000 to $15,000 is going to do a whole lot to improve your project, there's still no reason to give you the award or the grant. This isn't just sort of a prestigious award. So when you're writing your application, you want to focus on what the impact of those funds will be and what the impact of the activities that you're hoping to support with those funds are going to be on your project. And then again, be clear and specific in your budget. Don't be too general. We know that things change sometimes, so we aren't going to hold you to a specific airline or a specific firm for translation or something like that, but you do want to be clear about sort of where your costs are coming from and what you expect to use the funds on. And this is close to the end. I see we've got at least a couple of questions coming in already, but some resources just to start with. After this, we've got, always feel free to let us know if you have questions or if you need to know more about whether your project is eligible, anything like that. And so you can email us at dissertations@apsanet.org. Of course, visit our webpage. A lot of this information is on there, the specifics about the application and sort of a description of each of the elements of the application is available on our webpage. We also have an upcoming webinar. You'll be getting some information. It'll be going out on Twitter and also to all of our graduate student members on Tuesday, May 18th at 2 p.m. And that's going to feature 3 reviewers who were part of the reviewer panel in 2020. And so they have been through this process. They can tell us a little bit more about exactly what they were looking for, what made for a strong application, all of that. So I think that's going to be really helpful. Again, pay attention to your institutional resources. So your Office of Sponsored Research, your advisor is probably pretty busy right now. I know everyone is. But in addition to completing your advisor support form, talk to them about the proposal that you're putting together. Make sure that they know about the proposal and they know about what your plans are. Another thing I just want to flag, it's a little bit outside of this, but it's possible that you have a project that isn't a great fit for the DDRIG program, but still deserves funding and support. And so one big example of that might be if it turns out that you look at your budget, you look at the activities that you want to do, and you really only need a couple of $100 or a couple of $1,000, right? And that's not really the size of project that we are looking to fund through this program. So we're not going to throw out applications that don't get up to a $10,000 budget. If you have less than that, that's okay. But that is sort of the scale of project that this grant program is meant to support. And so if you end up realizing that your project isn't a great fit for this, but you still do need a little bit of funds for something, the Centennial Center at APSA also provides some grants and might be a good resource for that. So you might want to check that out. And so that is everything for my slideshow. I'm going to go ahead and stop screen sharing, and we can take a look at some of the questions.
Megan?
Yes.
I just wanted to point out, I think the next webinar is at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time instead of 2 p.m.
Oh, thank you.
Sure.
Yes, that's important. And again, that'll be going out to the graduate student members, and it'll also be on Twitter. So keep an eye out for a chance to register for that. Okay, so some questions. There's a question about retroactively paying for some of the activities that might happen over the summer. And that's really, so this is one of the places where talking to your institution is going to be important. So because the funds are dispersed through your institution, it's going to be based on their rules for pre-grant expenditures. And so you'll want to talk to them. We don't have any concerns about that, but it really depends on what their policies are. So with IRB approval, it is important that needs to happen absolutely before the funds are dispersed. And I see that in this particular question, this is sort of fit together with the prospectus defense. And what we prefer is for people to have both completed the prospectus defense and at least applied for IRB approval. They might not have received it yet, but applied before they apply to the grant. That doesn't, we understand that there are some logistical delays. So if you are going to have to put off IRB approval and your prospectus defense until a little bit later, we can work with that, but we need both of those things complete before the grant funds are dispersed in the fall. So that's not negotiable, but whether or not those are completed before the application time there's a little bit of wiggle room there. Yes, so we have a couple of questions in the chat as well. One having to do with IRB And that's, I think, just to be really clear about my answer here. Yes, so if you have applied, but not received IRB clearance, then that's an easy question. So that fits in with our application model. Go ahead and just show us proof that you've applied, and we'll certainly want to know about your clearance before we disperse the funds. But we really like to see that you've applied. That is preferred. If it's sort of a question of whether or not you can get the application in, again, we prefer that you do that, but there is a little bit of wiggle room. But both of those things need to be done before funds are dispersed. There's also a question about scholars that focus on international law. So, as you know, there is a Law and Society program, and that's being run out of, I think, ASU at this point. And then there's this political science program. There's not a hard and fast answer to that. So learn about both programs. There's not actually a rule that you can't apply for both, although you can't really receive both. So we'll need to sort of work through that. But the biggest thing is just making sure that you have a sense of sort of what the application process looks like, what the review process looks like, and what you think is going to work best for you and for your project as you decide. But you're absolutely welcome to apply to the APSA DDRIG program. We're not going to shunt you off to the Law and Society program. And in terms of talking to your advisor about the support form, it will not take very long. 5 minutes, 10 minutes. It is not like a letter of recommendation. We just want to make sure that your advisor is supportive of your project, knows that you're applying for this grant, and sort of pledges to support you through the project activities. So they don't need to spend a lot of time writing anything down. It's mostly check boxes and a couple of comments if they have them. So it's just a few minutes. Let's see. We have a question about a 3-paper dissertation. And the funds would focus on one of the papers, experiments for one of the papers. And for that, for these grants, we really want you to focus on the project activities. So for the most part, that's going to be a focus on the particular paper that these funds are supposed to support. You probably want to mention the overall theoretical framework and sort of the overall types of questions that you want to answer in your 3-paper dissertation. Those are good things to mention in the introduction, and when you're talking about sort of the intellectual merit overall of your project and what this is going to add to that. You might want to mention sort of your larger project, including the other 2 papers of your 3-paper dissertation, but structuring your application to really focus on the activities that this is supposed to support, and the intellectual merit and broader impact of those particular questions and research outcomes that you're looking for. That's going to be preferred. What happens if your research shifts and requires a new IRB approval? How does this affect the grant? So that one, for the most part, it doesn't affect the grant, as long as you are continuing what is fundamentally the same research project. If there are changes to your survey instrument or sort of relatively minor changes to your population, something like that, that might require new IRB approval, we're not super concerned about that. We do have a process if your project changes a little bit more than that. So if you are changing what you're using your funds on, there's a little bit of flex, but if you're making changes between categories of more than about 10%, we ask that you let us know. And technically what you're doing is you're putting in for approval to make that adjustment to the grant. Similarly, if you're making changes to your project such that it's not really the same project that the review panel reviewed and recommended funding, putting in a request for a change to your grant so that we can sort of review that is going to be required. Now, not everything that requires new IRB, like there are a whole bunch of things that might require new IRB approval that really don't fall under that, but some things would, and that's what you want to keep an eye out for. Let's see. So it looks like those are all of the open questions. One thing to note is that if you have questions about your specific project, go ahead and email us and let us know. We're happy to answer those. Okay. So we're gonna hold on for a little while just in case anyone has any additional questions and wants to add those, but we hope that you take some time to take a look. We hope that you okay, so we've got a question about examples of past successful projects. So the easiest answer to that is that on our website, and we can go ahead and share that as well. We have our list of grantees for this, our 23 grantees for the 2020 cycle. And so they've got a little bit of a description of their projects and what they're working on, and that's sort of the easiest place to take a look at that. We don't have examples of actual applications that we can share, but you can go through and sort of look at what the projects are and how that looks. We also have a question about the data management plan and what level of detail is expected. So that's relatively short. I don't remember, it's maybe 500 words. Does that sound right, Jessica? Yeah, so it's only about 500 words. It's not a hugely long project. We don't expect you to tell us sort of the specific sort of technical requirements that you're using to encode data, that sort of thing. It doesn't need to be super detailed, but we do need to have a sense of how you're thinking about these questions. So again, the two sort of major questions are, how are you keeping people's data safe, and how are you sharing data with the research community? And we need to have a sort of clear answer to how you're thinking about those two questions. We don't need a whole lot of specific detail about the technical aspects of how you're going to do that, though. So again, we'll hang out for a little while longer just if any other questions bubble up. But overall, thank you for joining us. Thank you for being interested in the program. We hope that you take a look and apply, tell others as well. This will be available as a recording on our website, so other people can go ahead and take a look if this might be helpful for them. So spread the word. And yeah, we hope to see your applications.